As the 2025 Texas legislative session came to a close, state lawmakers returned to a subject that dominated the previous session in 2023. The last two legislative sessions alone have seen an unparalleled influx of bills targeting Texas's trans population, attacking their access to healthcare, their bodily autonomy, and their ability to exist at all. This may seem like standard procedure for a state where LGBTQ plus people have long been political targets, but the rapid increase in harmful legislation comes on the cusp of a larger national trend. And yet, Texas is distinct in its long, rich history of queer culture that dates back over a century. Right here in the state's capital, Austin has served as a location for several landmark victories in the fight for equality, commanding a path forward for a community that continues to fight to this day. Challenging those in power is complex because the push to erase queer people often unfolds behind the scenes. While elected officials draft and pass these laws, it's the fundamentalist evangelical groups who fund their campaigns and ultimately drive these policies from the shadows. It's a tumultuous time in LGBTQ plus history across the country, but the celebration, acknowledgement, and understanding of what that history is makes the difference. So today we're going to take a look at all of this. With the help of Rox, our Trans Rights and Bodily Autonomy campaign co-chair, we'll explore the history of trans activism in Texas, the state legislators' latest attacks, and the forces behind them. From Austin DSA, my name's Marissa, and you're listening to episode 2 of the Austin DSA Batcast, The Struggle for Trans Rights. Austin's queer history didn't begin in the 1970s, but that decade marked a turning point. In 1971, the city hosted the National Gay Conference. Hundreds of gay and lesbian activists gathered, organizing publicly and helping to establish Austin as a center of Southern LGBTQ resistance. It was a breakthrough, but not for everyone. Groups like the Austin Gay Liberation Front and the Austin Lesbian Organization helped shape the city policy and public visibility. GLF fought for official status at the University of Texas, and ALO pushed for non-discrimination protections in housing, employment, and public spaces. These were big wins, but within these spaces, not everyone was represented equally. Feminists were pushed aside, trans people were rarely included at all. The movement was growing, but it came with boundaries. Even as progress was being made, it was clear that some voices were still being left out. Still, trans Texans were organizing, resisting, and creating care where systems failed them. In 1966, 5 years before that first conference in Austin, Dr. Paul Walker quietly performed gender-affirming surgery at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. That program would become a national leader in trans healthcare before it was eventually shut down. And in the decades that followed, trans activists like Phyllis Fry refused to stay invisible. Their work would reshape the future of Texas queer politics and bring trans rights to the front lines of today's fight. But to best contextualize modern trans activism in the state, it's worth looking back through history. In doing so, we can get a grasp on just how integral queerness is to the identity of the Lone Star State. Texas history is a particular point of pride amongst lifelong inhabitants of the state. So much so that to this day, Texas is the only state whose flag can fly at the same level as the US flag. It's that serious. But if you're going to incorporate the history of the state so deeply into your identity, then you must acknowledge Texas's history in its entirety. Not just the Alamo or the Dallas Cowboys, but all of it. This includes Texas history before it resembled anything close to the Texas of today at all. Pre-colonial Texas was full of thriving indigenous communities whose cultures were not bound by rigid gender constructs and defined roles. The Apaches, the Karankawa, and the Cuchandado all inhabited the Southwest and other regions of Texas, each of whom had members that embodied expansive gender identities. And while these individuals may not have always received widespread acceptance throughout all parts of their community, they did serve a special purpose. These aren't just historical inferences either. Indigenous people had specific words like Nze Itzan, meaning man-woman in Apache, or the umbrella term Two-Spirit, introduced in 1990 as a modern pan-Indigenous term to describe people who embody both male and female spirits. And to note, while this term is embraced by many, it's also contested within the queer Indigenous community, as some feel it generalizes diverse traditions and imposes a Western framework. Oftentimes, these individuals worked with medicine and acted as knowledge keepers and spiritual leaders for their communities. Gender-fluid Indigenous people also operated within their communities as mediators. This involved tasks like helping people overcome disagreements and social challenges, as well as metaphysical tasks like bridging the gap between the living and the dead. Trans people during this time were seen. They were important, active members of their communities who were integral to a peaceful and flourishing society. The onset of colonization in the 1500s would, unfortunately, bring about some of the earliest instances of trans persecution in Texas. As the Spaniard invasion of the Caribbean spread into mainland America, the conquistador Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca made note of what he saw. Before him stood, quote, devilish things, cuchindado men who would, quote, go about dressed as women and do women's tasks. To Cabeza de Vaca, these were, quote, impotent, effeminate men. This lack of gender definition directly conflicted with the Catholic belief system by which the Spaniards were structured. From that, it became a choice between religious conversion or death. As the genocide of the indigenous population expanded, with it came the loss of some of the earliest known history of trans people in human civilization. Yet here we are now, with the knowledge that trans and gender fluid individuals existed in society with stature and respect. That despite the best efforts of those who sought to eliminate them, we know these individuals existed long before hate and bigotry came to know them. And still, they have continued to exist long after. Simply put, trans history is Texas history. When we see the voices of today fight for a better tomorrow, it is not out of nowhere. It's the continuation of a centuries-long effort to live alongside everyone else the way they did once, hundreds of years ago. Let's go ahead and fast forward, like way forward. The struggle for equality finds itself in a new age, with new groups and new faces representing Texas history as it's being made. Decades of progress has seen decades of challenge, changing the landscape of activism and shifting both narratives and priorities. In the same way gay rights was at the center of social politics in the 1970s, trans rights have come to occupy that same space right here in the modern day. It's the turn of a new century, and like-minded Texans are once again coming together to form a movement that recognizes their existence. Activists like Paula Bowles, Lisa Sheps, and Beth Westbrook helped create the Austin Transgender Ordinance Initiative in the early 2000s, looking to expand upon the city's non-discrimination ordinances. They would come to find opposition from the usual suspects, but would also see pushback even within the queer community. The Lesbian Gay Rights Lobby and local human rights campaign chapter lobbied and worked against the ATOI. HRC denied them information tables at HRC's annual galas, and LGRL made influence at the Capitol difficult. Both groups would come to recognize trans rights in time. The LGRL would become Equality Texas in 2006, but it serves to reflect the magnitude of resistance towards initial trans movements. When Austin finally added gender identity to the city's NDOs, ATOI would become the Transgender Education Network of Texas, the largest statewide BIPOC trans-led, trans-focused policy, education, and advocacy organization in the state of Texas. Each legislative session, Tent works around the clock to file bills that enrich the lives of Texas residents and track legislation as it makes its way through Congress. A pillar of the trans community, their work goes beyond politics as the organization serves to house, feed, and counsel those who need it. The new millennium would also see Texas continue its tradition of firsts in queer history. Born in San Antonio, Phyllis Fry's early life is authentically Texan. With a proclivity for the outdoors, Fry achieved the rank of Eagle Scout as a child, also an early indicator of her work ethic. She was involved in school, becoming a member of the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps, and ended up attending Texas A&M University, where she was a member of the Corps of Cadets and the Texas A&M Singing Cadets. After graduating, Fry would join the Army. It's here, in a historic parallel to the plight of today's trans military members, where Fry began to disclose her struggles with gender identity to her superiors. This was, unsurprisingly, met with confrontation, and she'd be sent home from her post in Germany, back to the United States for various forms of conversion therapy and hypnosis, until being forced to resign and honorably discharged. The 70s would be a turbulent decade for Fry, with numerous personal and professional setbacks, largely due in part to discrimination towards her gender identity. Still, Fry found herself in the thick of the activist movement of the decade, fighting for trans rights long before the cause had much traction. Lisa Sheps has even made note that Fry was there from the start with her Trans Rights Are Human Rights banner, marching alongside everyone else. The next couple decades eventually led her to the University of Houston, where she received her JD and became a lawyer. By the 1990s, her journey became historic. Beyond her day work of assisting LGBTQ+ people in need of a lawyer, Fry would grow her activism outreach by organizing. The Human Rights Campaign, yes, the same Human Rights Campaign from earlier, drew criticism for its endorsement of the 1995 through 96 Employment Non-Discrimination Act. The legislation specifically did not include protections for trans people. It passed, and Fry got active. She led a gathering of trans people to Washington, D.C., and into the offices of 46 senators who voted for the ENDA to discuss and advocate for expanding the protections the law offered. The 2000s came along, and Fry established herself as both a prominent lawyer for trans people in name change and discrimination cases and a figurehead within the community. In 2010, recognizing her contributions and achievements, Houston Mayor Anise Parker appointed Fry as an associate judge for the City of Houston Municipal Courts. She would be the first openly transgender judge ever appointed in the United States. Fry's political trailblazing and the groundwork of Bulls, Shep, and Westbrook serve as further examples of activism from Texas's past evolving into the activism of today. Unfortunately, Texas would love to erase that past, a past that sought to provide care to those who needed it most. But you can't rewrite history. As far back as the 60s, Texas was a pioneer in transgender healthcare. The University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston was home to the Gender Dysphoria Research and Service Program, where Dr. Paul Walker performed the clinic's first ever gender-affirming surgery in 1966. The clinic would eventually close in the 80s, with UTMB continuing to provide transgender care well into the 90s. But with only a few clinics of its kind in the entire country, Texas once again sat at the forefront of progress. Returning to the present day, trans healthcare in Austin has seen a multitude of organizations lead the way as well. Kind Clinic, which launched in 2015, quickly became a cornerstone for the local LGBTQ+ community, providing free gender-affirming care and sexual health services. Other groups like the Waterloo Counseling Center, an Austin-based organization formed out of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, provides counseling and mental health services to LGBTQ+ folks, another organization born out of the past and serving into the future. We know that lasting change works best when it comes from the ground up. And Austin's queer movements over the decades are proof of that. The political activism and communal bonds formed by ordinary people continue to have an impact. But with every political victory, a new fight emerges. Much like the culture war that emerged from Anita Bryant's Save Our Children campaign in the 70s, today's opposition masks themselves as guardians of innocence and protectors of religious sanctity. As the first organized opposition to the gay rights movement of the time, Save Our Children laid the groundwork for conservative opposition to LGBTQ+ activism for decades to come. Despite starting in protest to local legislation in Florida, the campaign became an adopted strategy by Republicans nationwide and ballooned into a cultural phenomenon that managed to stick with the collective American consciousness. Through misinformation and media manipulation, the campaign made a deliberate effort to paint homosexuals as dangerous, amoral detriments to society. These tactics, activist groups, and political strategies have shown and morphed into the opposition movement that exists today. The rise of the modern-day culture war and focus on identity politics over the last 5 to 10 years has brought forth a reinvigorated influx of anti-trans legislation. Nationally, Republicans have been able to completely dominate the public consciousness on this topic. They've managed to shift the Overton window in such a way that has made centrist and even some center-left Democrats unreliable allies in this fight. You're probably familiar with the bigoted narratives put forth by opponents, whether it be about bathrooms, women's sports, public education, or healthcare. States all across the country have made anti-trans legislation a priority, as America's fascist movement has found a new head of steam in the Trump era. Fundamentalist evangelical groups have become emboldened, tapping into the deepest wells of their resources to lobby politicians who will do their bidding. The current Trump administration alone has put forth several major executive orders targeting trans people in the military, gender and sexual identity discussions in schools, and trans participation in sports, just to name a few. On a more granular level, the state-by-state assault on queer people in recent years can be traced back to one piece of South Dakota legislation that laid the blueprint for the rest of the country, including Texas. The bill in question, formally named the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, originally planned to make it a felony for doctors to give transgender children under 16 gender-affirming medical care. While that proved to be difficult on its own, the bill contained language and policy, like specifically defining biological sex, that has been adopted in almost every single piece of major anti trans legislation introduced since. During the 2019 South Dakota legislative session, Representative Fred Deutsch was in direct correspondence with 18 anti trans activists, doctors, and lawyers about the development of a bill to be put forward in the legislature. A series of leaked emails highlighting the communication between these groups and state lawmakers offers some of the most candid insight into the processes that go into creating these kinds of bills. Groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF, Child and Parental Rights Campaign, the Kelsey Coalition, and the Liberty Council all existed in Deutsch's circle, meticulously crafting the language of the bill in a way that does not concede an inch of the narrative. Sometimes the resistance includes things as granular as the individual words transgender, cisgender, or non binary. Quote, using them surrenders the language. If the other side's language frames the debate, we lose, said Richard Mast of Liberty Council. In other instances, these groups would directly provide counter-arguments to South Dakota legislators to use on the floor of Congress. Bernadette Broyles, the president and general counsel of a Georgia-based law firm called the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, asserted that, quote, there is no constitutional right to chemically and surgically mutilate one's healthy body. Where there's no disease to be treated, that is child abuse. Members of Deutsch's team also referred to the citation that gender-affirming care can reduce suicide rates for trans kids as, quote, abusive, and that it is merely a way for doctors to coerce parents to consent to gender-affirming care for their child. Also in Deutsch's ear was Michael Laidlaw, a California endocrinologist who was adamant about his opposition to physicians prescribing puberty blockers, accusing them of willfully harming children. Laidlaw would go so far as to say, quote, the physician is the criminal in these scenarios and must be prosecuted by the law. At the time of its writing, the same groups and individuals working with Deutsch on his bill were workshopping the same ideas to Republican lawmakers all across the country. In 9 other states, variations of the Vulnerable Child Protection Act were proposed in state legislatures with varying degrees of success. Florida Representative Anthony Sabatini directly contacted the previously quoted Richard Mast as he looked for experts who would support a version of the VCPA in his state. Deutsch and other members of his VCPA team had a major impact on Alabama legislation, as they coached leaders of conservative groups like the Eagle Forum on how to lead legislators to, quote, adopt a bill similar to Representative Fred Deutsch's. Initial versions of this Alabama bill would fail, much in the same way initial versions of the VCPA did. Both bills, however, eventually became law after years of revision and continued advocacy at the hands of Deutsch's original circle. The momentum of this movement found its way into Texas, led by the same groups with the same goals. This had undoubtedly the largest impact on the 2023 legislative session. In that session alone, Texas managed to introduce more than 20% of all anti-LGBTQ+ bills that were presented in legislatures across the country. These bills covered a lot of ground, attacking every aspect of LGBTQ+ life. Some of these were not new to the legislature, but where 2021 saw the introduction of bills to ban trans participation in sports, 2023 saw the introduction of bills to ban trans existence entirely. This escalation comes at the hands of these conservative, evangelical extremist groups who continue to stretch the limitations of our legal and judicial systems to see what's actually possible. The 2023 session saw 7 major anti-LGBTQ+ bills pass that have fundamentally changed the way queer people are able to live in this state. A state where its very own citizens spent decades paving a path forward for marginalized groups, put the best interest of religious fundamentalists first. Texas has set queer people back in ways we're only just beginning to see the effects of. The 2025 state legislature may have closed, leaving behind its own trail of anti-trans legislation. But still, in the midst of this, Austin residents continue to resist and take necessary action required to challenge hate and bigotry every step of the way. So, where are we at now, and where do we go from here? More than 100 pieces of anti-LGBTQ+ legislation were filed this past session. Among these, Austin DSA's Trans Rights and Bodily Autonomy campaign were tracking 6 that ultimately passed, 3 of which specifically have major consequences for trans youth. The most notable of the lot was Senate Bill 12, which bans diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and policies from K through 12 public schools. Schools can fire employees for engaging in DEI duties, the specifics of which are left intentionally vague. and the bill makes it illegal for teachers and other school employees to assist in a student's social transition. This means that teachers are barred from referring to a trans student by their preferred name and pronouns. Additionally, they cannot provide students with any information about social transitioning, and schools cannot authorize or sponsor student clubs based on sexual orientation or gender identity, like the Gay Straight Alliance. A microcosm of the larger effort to deny trans people the right to exist in the state, SB 12 sees the vision of Fred Deutsch and his many collaborators continue on. Since the 2025 session is over, this is in fact where we are now. But as the right-wing evangelical vision presses on, so does the opposition movement. And this is where we go from here. Let's talk to a DSA comrade who's been in the thick of this fight in Texas. Rox is the co-chair of the Trans Rights and Bodily Autonomy campaign organized by Austin DSA to combat anti-trans legislation in Texas and facilitate trans solidarity in workers' unions. Rox, thank you for being here. And great shirt, cool pin.
Thank you, thank you.
Shows the
Yeah,
pin.
this is like one of my favorite ones, just because I like that it's a little bit aggressive, like don't mess with trans kids, you know. That's yeah, my favorite message of all the buttons I've got.
Hell yeah. So for our first question, let's start with the beginning of your journey. How
Mhm.
and when did you get involved in trans advocacy?
Yeah, so I am so happy to answer that question. And I will also say that my story comes with the content warning of completed suicide of a trans woman. So I mean, I like to make sure that folks know that going into it. But yeah, about 7 years ago, my partner at the time, this lovely trans woman named Amelia, she went through a mental health crisis that was, very difficult, obviously, for her and for everyone around her trying to support her through that. And this was absolutely the start of my advocacy. I learned so much about how our mental health care systems systematically fail trans and intersex people. And, just watching what Amelia went through really motivated me to, begin advocating for anti-carceral approaches to suicide within mental health care systems. Now, skip a few years, I moved to Texas, and here we are in kind of more of a basic rights place at this time. But I still feel that, despite not really being a spiritual person, I do think that Amelia continues to be with me in my advocacy, just in that, like I think that like her legacy is present in my action, if that makes sense. And so like having been through this difficult thing in losing her, I feel empowered and like what I'm doing matters. So that's my story. That's how I came to be here. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Could you clarify for the listeners what anti-carceral approaches to mental health care look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, what that phrase means to me is taking like a good look at how our mental health care systems, particularly involuntary hospitalization, tend to mimic, carceral systems. Like involuntary hospitalization tends to involve like especially in Texas, things like seclusion and restraints and poor treatment, the taking away of human rights. And I think like I do want to say that it is not always this way. For some folks, certainly hospitalization, whether voluntary or not, can be like a powerful healing thing. So I don't want to just, I don't want to ignore the nuance here. Absolutely. But more often than not, for queer and trans people, Black and Brown people, people with particularly stigmatized diagnoses like schizophrenia, involuntary hospitalization on average can make like mental health and even suicide attempts worsen rather than like actually help. So when I say anti-carceral approaches to suicide, what I really mean is like taking like a good look at those systems and making sure that they're working for everybody. And like as an example of that, there's this idea of having respite centers that are staffed fully by like peers in the mental health advocacy space. And I think those are really cool. Like they tend to uh, look less like hospitals and look more like somebody's home, more like a place of healing, quite frankly. So yeah, that's kind of what I mean by that.
Thank you for that. That's
For sure.
very helpful context. And then now we'll move on to the current era. Can you talk about what your experience was like during this current legislative session?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I'll say that it was overall a positive experience for me. I found that I felt like deeply moved by, my comrades that I was working with. I met some really extraordinary activists doing this work that I take a lot of inspiration from. Like I'm certainly not doing this work alone, and I'm not even necessarily like one of the more important voices in this work. But yeah, it was on the whole a positive experience, and as much as it was like also a very difficult one, I think that I did put myself out there quite a lot. I testified against anti-trans bills quite a few times. I gave some testimony that I wouldn't say that it went viral, but certainly a lot of folks watched it, especially within Austin DSA and the larger community. So I hope that that was impactful for folks. I did also end up writing an op-ed about that experience that I just truly, what I was hoping to get out of that was for, people who are not as well versed in the trans advocacy space to give it a read and learn a little bit more about what's going on. And I think it achieved that. So I'm proud of that. I guess overall, I feel proud of myself. I feel like what I did alongside other incredible activists like was quite worthwhile. And it's hard to give like an answer that is this overwhelmingly positive, but I do kind of stand by it. And I don't want to like ignore the hard parts. Like certainly doing this work can be exhausting. It's vulnerable work. It involves like constantly all the time being faced with the harsh reality of life for trans and intersex people in this time in Texas. And there were moments where I was like, oh God, why am I doing this? To be so real. But yeah, overwhelmingly, I feel proud of myself for doing the work.
Yeah, that's amazing. You gave like such a moving testimony against HB 778. And like what you just said, I can imagine it's just like a million times more difficult to like come up with a coherent and like effective testimony when you're like testifying against something that is aiming to take away your rights, like two
Mhm,
people that like
mhm,
want to
mhm.
do that.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah. I think
on
I
that
think
note, oh,
oh,
go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, like, I think yes and no. I think it being so deeply personal and the fact that I tied that testimony to losing Amelia, it actually helps quite a lot. It made me feel, again, just empowered. And like, I found that when I was writing it, it just wasn't even that hard to write because of how close to home it was. And I think like almost selfishly, that's too strong a word. I'm being mean to myself unnecessarily. But I think like doing that in that way was um something that I like benefited from a lot personally. It helped me to like grieve Amelia in a slightly different way than I've been able to before. So yeah, I just think on the whole that even that was a really positive and healing experience for me.
That's amazing. Um, on that note, talking about giving testimony at a place like Texas Congress, um, do you have any notes for listeners about, or tips for listeners about how to give an effective testimony, whether it be in the halls of Texas Congress or, at like a city town hall on the local level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I've kind of already spoken to this, but the most important piece of it, difficult and challenging as it is to get personal. You know, really powerful testimony tends to be personal in this way. And you definitely don't always have to, go that deeply personal with it. It can also be effective to speak to more general arguments so long as they're like well tailored to the issue and have like some personal element to it. Like, for example, if you are going to give testimony about trans kids, it can help to speak to like real experiences that you've had either working with trans kids or just like, if there's like a trans kid in your life, you can speak about like how that bill would impact them. With the caveat that it's very important not to out people or speak to experiences other than our own, especially when we're talking about children. But I guess I just would like summarize that to say that we all have personal experiences that tie us to this work. Like everyone who's doing trans advocacy work has some personal tie. And I think it can be both like a vulnerable thing, but a really important thing to dig into that if you're going to give testimony.
Next is a more, general question about like the ideas behind this fight. What do you think are the ideas influencing our opposition, and how do you feel is the best way to combat them?
Yeah, I think for a very long time it has been about targeting literal children, which is horrifying, I mean, I think like there's something really different about this moment in time compared to like the history of LGBTQ plus advocacy. Like certainly the opposition has like targeted children indirectly before just by saying just by erasure and by saying that adults are a danger to children. But this is really the first moment that kids have been front and center as like, oh, they are under attack. And I think like we have to respond to that by, you know, as best we can, um, like redirecting towards the conversation towards talking about adults while at the same time, pushing back really strongly against that narrative. Like, hey, trans kids, just let them be kids. We got to let them be who they are. I think humanizing that can be really important and, putting it in the context of like, um, you know, just like trans existence being a natural phenomenon and also like just where we can pointing out like hey like cisgender people also deserve to wear whatever they want to wear, dress however they want to dress, use whatever name they feel most comfortable with. I think it can be really simple like that. And then the other piece to it that I don't want to forget about is like the focus on trans women in sports. Um, because that argument is very dangerous for us. I think it's an argument that most people's gut instincts kind of cuts the wrong way on. A lot of, well-meaning liberals, for example, will think about like a trans woman playing a sport and have a reaction to that and think like, well, that doesn't seem fair to me. And like I think we have to pay attention to that. And I think that like, my response to that is simply that trans women are barely represented in sports. Not only that, but there's very little scientific evidence to demonstrate any kind of dominance on the part of trans women. But I also think that that can be dangerous too because a lot of folks don't buy it a lot of the time. And I think actually one thing we can do there is take it back to thinking about kids and fairness. Like, if the right's gonna make it about kids, we can too. And like I think a lot of folks, like even, well-meaning folks who are concerned about trans women in sports, like it can help to point out to them the unfairness towards children who just want to play, who just want to be included. And I think finally, another thing we can say about this is one dangerous piece to the political landscape around this is that the conservative narrative around trans women playing sports is unfortunately quite an effective one. It involves saying the quiet part out loud of if trans people are considered men when they play sports. It's very easy for the in sports piece to get dropped off, and for people to think of trans women as men in general. And I think, another unfortunate consequence of this is, what we've seen around cis women with masculine features who are also attacked in the same way, playing sports, and just kind of the bottom line of the policing of trans women in sports, dangerous for everybody. It's pretty effective messaging. And I think, like, bottom line for me is that the road to fascism is paved with many small human rights violations. And excluding trans women, especially children, from sports, I think is just like very characteristic of that.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving us all that context, Rox. For this next part, we're going to talk about what came out of the current legislative session and what to do next. Despite the small number of anti-trans bills that ended up passing in comparison to the total amount of legislation proposed, these 6 bills, known colloquially as the dirty half dozen, cover a lot of ground. For instance, House Bill 229 makes the effort of specifically defining male and female and codifying them as only 2 sexes. It goes even so far as to say that intersex people do not qualify as a third sex. This is, at its core, a blatant violation of human rights. And HB 229 serves as a baseline for the conservative effort to deny the existence of trans people. The irony, of course, simply saying so does not make it so. Similarly, Senate Bill 1188 requires a person's sex assigned at birth to be recorded in their electronic health records, essentially outing anyone whose recorded gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. The bill functions as both a scare tactic and a tool which to identify and persecute. 2 of the bills within the half dirty dozen, Senate Bill 1257 and House Bill 18, take the attacks directly to healthcare. SB 1257 stipulates that insurance providers who provide gender-affirming care are now also required to provide detransition-related care. By increasing the amount of liability insurers hold, the risk-averse nature of the entire insurance business model means providers are less likely to offer any coverage at all. Additionally, with insurance companies now on the hook for extra care, costs are set to become prohibitively expensive, making the transition process far less accessible. HB 18 may be even more nefarious in that its attack on trans people was made in the form of an amendment, tacked onto a bill that was largely positive. The bill expands access to telehealth mental health care in rural areas, but invalidates the ability to receive that care if it affirms a trans kid's identity. The last of our bills here continues the trend of posing as legislation aimed to protect children. Here, House Bill 1106 modifies the definition of child abuse in the state, explicitly condoning parental misgendering and encouraging conversion therapy. This applies not only to trans kids, but to all LGBT children. Parents doing right by their children made out to be abusers. These 6 bills encapsulate the current status quo of anti-trans legislation. Gone are the days of legislative confusion surrounding verbiage and semantics. We've reached a point where the attacks are becoming specific, pinpointing key aspects of trans existence in order to deny them the right to exist at all. So much of what's happening here continues to ignore the reality that trans people have always existed and they'll never stop existing. Things are bleak, but there's optimism in the truth. So now we're going to take it back to Rox. Could you tell us a little bit about what the impact of these anti-trans bills that passed during this session will look like for the community throughout Texas?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that part of the impact, we don't quite know yet what it's going to look like, particularly for trans and intersex adults. There's a lot of uncertainty just because, the healthcare bill that you mentioned, because it targets insurance companies, and we don't quite know yet what they're going to do with kind of these intimidation tactics. It's completely possible that trans healthcare will not be cost prohibitive if insurers are made to prioritize the trans community. And I say made to because that's really what it is. I'm hoping that DSA will be able to utilize union pressure to try to keep insurance companies like responsible for trans healthcare. That will be able to pressure employers also to contract with insurers that maintain coverage. And similarly, the impact of like what we're calling the gender regulation bill, the one that defines gender as binary and unchangeable. That one is unfortunately designed to apply to the interpretation of all Texas law. However, we don't yet know what different government agencies might do with that. We don't know if, various like businesses will comply. We don't know quite how the landscape might shift for adults. I will say for trans kids, unfortunately, it's a little bit more clear that like kids are gonna feel the impact, particularly in school. Um, I think like that even if and there is of course there is some hope here that the bill around like eliminating GSAs, the bill that targets like teacher support for trans youth, there's some hope that that will be ruled unconstitutional. ACLU is already suing. I'm hearing that there's some hope around a possible injunction against that law. So there's still some uncertainty there, which is great. But I will say that I think that like schools are likely to behave conservatively. That's just kind of the pattern we've seen in the past that like unless we pressure them to do otherwise, um, you know, like schools and like administrations and school boards are likely to kind of comply in advance and just kind of the way that we see happening all across the country in terms of over compliance to anti-LGBTQ plus laws, like even just pulling DEI is something that's happening at large companies, even those that have historic, I mean, it's not that surprising, but even those that have historically supported LGBTQ plus rights. So I would not be surprised at all if schools were to, at the very least, like bar teachers from assisting with social transition. That said, like I definitely have some hope here that we'll be able to continue to support kids. I am hoping to work with Austin DSA on reaching out to LGBTQ plus clubs at various high schools and seeing what we can do to support them in continuing to meet. I hope that that will involve like union support. I hope that that will involve parental support, that we'll be able to identify, um, you know, already supportive adults in those kids' lives who can get involved in helping them continue to meet with each other. I think I'll just like summarize that by saying that trans kids who are supported by a single adult are half as likely to attempt suicide. So it is just absolutely vital that we find a way to create supportive spaces for trans kids. So just to kind of summarize here, like I do have a lot of hope. I think that the outcomes here are not certain. I think that the impact to the community will be significant, but it's not insurmountable. And like really with every single one of these bills, I have reason to hope that we'll be able to find creative ways of fighting back like we always do.
Thank you for giving us a clear picture, a little bit about what the impact's going to look like. Do you have any advice for listeners about what they can do moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think um, probably one of my biggest pieces of advice is to be in community with other trans people, with other activists. I think that is so important. We cannot, should not do this work alone. We absolutely need each other to have any hope of resisting given, the oppressive forces at play. Our community is freaking beautiful. We take care of each other. So yeah, community is the way, number one. And then the other piece of advice that I would give here is to center people of color in this work. Always, always, always. Like we got to remember that Black trans women threw the first brick at Stonewall. And I certainly don't want to like idealize that aspect of things just because I think that puts like unfair pressure on people of color. But I do want to acknowledge that, like, frankly, a lot of what I have learned personally about how to organize well has been from people of color. For example, my supervisor, Sophia Sepulveda, has been a huge influence on me. She is an extraordinary activist who I've learned a ton from. There's like Natalie of the House of Lepore. She's a Black trans woman who gave very powerful testimony during the last legislative session that honestly, like I took a lot of inspiration from. And there's like, there's someone I got to mention. Um, Federico Figueroa. He is like an activist based in Seattle, and he used to do trans rights work here with me in Texas. And when I do this work, I think of him constantly. There's some part of me that feels like it should be him at the helm leading the charge and not me. But I'm just like deeply grateful for the Black and brown trans activists in my life who have kind of paved the way for me. And I can get really specific about that. It's things like instructing me about how we need to talk about safety in a non-colorblind way. This can look like supporting trans women, particularly Black and brown trans women, when they need to use the bathroom. Like literally, white people should be going alongside folks when possible, and assuming that that is wanted, just because like Black and brown trans women are so much more visibly the target of anti-trans violence in those spaces. It's things like at protests, encouraging white people to like position themselves at the edge between the opposition and the most vulnerable people among us. I guess the only caveat to that is that it's important to be comfortable doing that. We do not want white people who are going to be anxious at a protest to put themselves in that position. And honestly, that includes me. Like I get anxious as hell at protests. But yeah, I think it's just like just recognizing how essential Black and brown activism is to this work.
Thank you so much for that advice. I think that's going to be really helpful for listeners, especially listeners coming to this issue for the first time. Well, that is it for our interview. Thank you so much, Rox, for all of your great insights today. And do you have any plugs coming up for the Trans Rights and Bodily Autonomy campaign before we sign off?
Ooh, let's see, do I? Yeah. One thing we're working on that I'm super excited about is we'll be doing like an enhanced library card drive. Um, you know, Library cards are a form of ID that do not have a gender marker on them. And it is a really great idea for not just trans people, but also cis people to obtain these IDs, just because you can use them anywhere. Well, not anywhere. I think the main place you can't use them is you can't use it as a driver's license, and you can't use it to vote. But it is good for like the Austin Police Department and most government agencies, as well as most nonprofits will accept these IDs. And it's about like protecting trans people and also undocumented immigrants and unhoused people who often like will like need to use these IDs. And I just think like if everyone gets one and like brings it around with you, especially to protests, that can be like a huge protective factor for marginalized people who are at risk of like experiencing discrimination, particularly police violence. So very excited about that whole concept of doing a drive to obtain enhanced library cards. And I will say that the Trans Rights and Bodily Autonomy campaign, we are known for throwing amazing parties, and we are planning to throw a little celebration. And the entrance fee will be bringing your enhanced library card ID. So I really can't recommend doing that enough to our listeners because it's going to be a grand gay old time.
Hell yeah, so exciting. We'll have more details about that event coming soon. So for listeners, keep an eye on Austin DSA's social media. We'll be posting information about that. And if you're not signed up for the newsletter, you can do that at our website, austindsa.org, where we'll also be sending out details about that event. But yeah, thank you so much, Rox. Activists like Rox are not alone in this fight. All across the country, people have banded together to combat the growing number of anti-trans legislation in state legislatures. Historically, they're not alone either. When we look to the past, we see the struggles of those who came before and the victories they achieved in the end. It's never easy, it's always been a battle, one that relies on the collective efforts of individuals fighting for one another instead of against each other. And that's where we come in. If you'd like to get involved, here are a few things that you can do. Join DSA and get involved with our Trans Rights and Bodily Autonomy campaign. We're working to address the impact of the policy changes as a result of this legislative session that will go into effect September 1st of this year. And if you're in a union, you can reach out to us at TRBA at austindsa.org to learn how your union can support trans rights and bodily autonomy. Thank you for tuning in to episode 2 of the Austin DSA Batcast. We're just getting started and the work ahead is real, but so is our power. Subscribe, leave a review, and check the notes for everything we mentioned today. We'll see you next time, and in the meantime, keep showing up, keep fighting, and keep believing that trans rights are human rights.